Thank you, everyone who's here in person tonight. Thanks for everyone who's joining on Zoom. Super excited to have Langdon Cook here from Seattle. I was able to meet him at Soma Camp in January. I actually asked him today if maybe he brought the rain with him, and we're really needing it. I was sad that there wasn't a lot of mushrooms here to take him out hunting for the weekend, but we did find a hen and a few trumpets, and we got to kind of do a really quick tour around the state, kind of showing him what we're all about. What I learned is that Langdon is super curious. He's not just asking for things so that he can repeat them. I feel like what I see in his books and what I see on his blogs and his website is that he truly wants to learn the stuff. He's a reporter who's used to kind of finding out the story, and he wants to share that knowledge with us because he finds it exciting and thinks we will too. So it's really just this kind of the more is more, the more is merrier. I'm sure there's a few secret spots that you would maybe not show us.
But it's all, you just got to read between the lines.
Okay. Yeah. But in general, he seems very generous with his knowledge, seems very curious about where he is, who he's with. The Mushroom Hunters is not his first book. The Fat of the Land was his first book. My mentor, Ron, gave me The Mushroom Hunters as a gift years and years ago. This is actually the 10th anniversary of that book, and it just came out in paperback. So I urge you all to buy it and enjoy it. And welcome, Langdon. Thanks for being here.
Well, hello, everyone. So I thought I would take questions during the presentation. So for those of you here in the audience, you can just raise your hand. If you're in Zoom land, I guess send it via chat and Kathy will relay it to me. It's really great to be here. This is actually my first time in your neck of the woods. And I think Kathy's being a little modest because we went just a little bit north, and I know you've just finally been getting some rain here, but it's pretty wet up there. And I was just blown away by the diversity of fungi that I saw in the forests. And you all are really lucky to have all this amazing land around you. And I know I'm going to try and get back here regularly to hunt. What a great spot. So tonight, I'm going to take you on a tour of my book, The Mushroom Hunters. I hope you've all had something to eat, because in addition to being a tour of the book, it's kind of a patch to plate presentation. So I will be showing some slides of mushrooms in finished dishes, some of the things that I like to make. But the book really, it got its start. It's my second book, as Kathy mentioned, but it got its start during the process of writing my first book, Fat of the Land. There's a chapter in there about hunting morels. And I was up in north central Washington State. I live in Seattle. And you probably have heard that in the Northwest, the greater Northwest, we have this phenomenon where after these wildfires, mountain wildfires that we have, we sometimes have incredible flushes of morels. And pickers have sort of caught on to this. And so they sort of chase the fires looking for bird morels. And this is way back in the spring of 2007. We were doing that, me and some friends, after what at the time had been the biggest wildfire in Washington State history, the Tripod Complex, which burned 200,000 acres. At the time, that was considered an unbelievable conflagration, just a huge forest fire. Since then, we've had multiple fires of that size. So that just gives you a sense of the changing climate. But at the time, it was the biggest. And so the following spring, we got in the woods, and it looked a little bit like that. And it was quite a bit of charred landscape. You can see a friend of mine in the background there with his, nice sort of woven Guatemalan mushroom basket. And we all had baskets like that. And we were sort of traipsing through the woods, carrying our nice baskets. And, maybe we had, 5 pounds or so of mushrooms. And we were pretty happy about that, feeling pretty good about ourselves. And we came into a clearing, and across the clearing, we saw 2 guys that were wearing big rucksacks on their backs. And I would say each one of them with morels piled high in these rucksacks, each one had about 75 pounds. And exactly, that's how we felt. And I mean, the first thing that I wanted to know was, how did they do it? You know, how I thought of mushroom hunting as sort of nature's Rubik's Cube. You know, you have to do all these combinations. You have to figure out elevation and slope aspect and, you know, sort of microclimate and rain and soil type and tree composition and all these factors that go into finding large quantities of mushrooms. And these guys had really figured it out. They had sort of mastered it. And we looked at them and they looked at us, and not a word was exchanged. And then they just sort of turned on their heels and disappeared back into the timber. It was like a Bigfoot sighting. But it lingered with me, the thought of these two characters who had really unlocked nature's secrets. And I kind of vowed at that moment that I was going to learn how they did it. And I kind of intuitively knew that these were professional mushroom hunters. And so I wanted to find these guys, you know, learn their secrets, learn how they did this. But, you know, I was and here's the sort of, you know, flush of morels that we like to find. Question over there. Yeah.
Now, I've obviously a lot of people here have heard the bird morels and stuff, but when you do that, is it like that in scattered area, or is it?
Scattered area. It is not carpeted, you know, the whole forest. No, you still have to work out the best habitat. Okay. So you still need to be able to, now sometimes with a really good burn, it's just, you walk into the forest and there they are. But most of the time you still have to, you know, put on your hunting cap and figure it out. Yeah. So, you know, the image of these two characters kind of stuck in my mind, and I decided, okay, I'm going to get on the mushroom trail and try and figure out how it's done. And so I started traveling around. Like you all, I'm a recreational mushroom hunter. I'm not a professional mushroom hunter. So I got on what's known as the mushroom trail. And if you can imagine an area it's basically the greater Pacific Northwest, okay? And it encompasses maybe from Northern California up through Oregon and Washington and BC, all the way to like Southeast Alaska, across the Yukon, down through Western Montana and Idaho. If you draw a circle around that region, you can pick mushrooms every day of the year. And so that's why the professionals are kind of working in that region. And so they call it the Mushroom Trail. And I just decided, okay, I'm going to start driving around and try and find these guys. Okay, so I became acquainted with a lot of lawn gnomes right off the bat, you know, and saw some really wonderful chainsaw art along the way. But, you know, these sort of places I was going, these were mushroom festivals, right, where people like us gather, and we like to tell war stories about mushrooms and have mushroom hunting contests and make dishes with mushrooms and, you know, buy beautiful toddler-sized morels that have been carved up with a, you know, chainsaw. And that's all lots of fun. But that's not really where the professionals, the guys who are doing this for a paycheck, are hanging out. But nevertheless, I kind of wandered around, and I ended up, some of you might have been to Boyne City for their annual morel festival that they've now been having, I think, for more than maybe 30 years there. And they have what they like to call the world's greatest morel hunting contest or something like that. And I showed up in Boyne City and literally, you know, got on a school bus and was taken to, you know, a spot, an undisclosed location in the woods. I was surprised they didn't actually blindfold me and take me there. But, you know, no maps, no compasses, you know, the school buses, they stopped in this field, opened the doors. We all got out. Somebody blew, you know, a bullhorn, and we just took off into the woods for 2 hours and tried to find as many morels as we could. I was kind of bewildered, I have to say. Now, you all might be familiar with these woods, but they look very different from the woods that I'm used to in the Pacific Northwest, with all these different hardwood trees that I didn't know. And actually, you see a lot of the greenery in the foreground there. I think those might be ramps. So there's always a consolation prize, right, when you don't find morels. But I think the winner on this particular day found something like 240 morels. And maybe I found like 2 or 3. So it was a humbling experience. But you know, I did find some nice yellow morels eventually, wandering around those woods, and found some friends of mine in Marquette on the Upper Peninsula who made a wonderful meal for me with some scallops, pan-seared scallops, and some potatoes. And you can see the morels cut into little discs there. And that's a stinging nettle sauce, which is like the perfect spring sauce to get you moving when you need to be out in the woods all day. So that was the sort of thing that we would prepare when we got our stuff home. But again, these were mostly recreational pickers. Even the guy who, won this morel hunting contest, really more of a recreational picker, wasn't doing it for a paycheck. He was doing it for glory, no doubt. But he wasn't, he was not paying for his gas with it, right? And so then I traveled down to the beautiful mountains of southern Colorado to the Telluride Mushroom Festival, which has been going on for decades. You can see just what a scenic place it is there, and met some more mushroom characters, as you can see. Yeah. And you might recognize some folks in that. I think maybe the editor of Fungi magazine might be in that picture. But lots of characters in Telluride, and including the white rabbit and the Amanita muscaria mobile. A really fun time had by all. And up in the mountains, we picked their wonderful porcini that they have with those beautiful brick red caps, and brought it back to our extremely expensive lodging in Telluride, and cooked up wonderful porcini appetizers. Which, by the way, if I have guests over for dinner and they've never had this sort of experience of eating fresh porcini, this is what I make for them, which is just simply, porcini sliced, on the profile, about a 1/4 inch thick, marinated, tossed on the grill. You get those nice grill marks, or you could saute it in butter in the pan. Very simple. And then just on a little baguette with some ricotta cheese. And ricotta is so mild that it doesn't get in the face of the porcini. And also it's a nice kind of glue, right? So your mushroom doesn't go flying off when you try and serve it to somebody. But a little sea salt and some herb from the garden. And that is the way I like to really enjoy the nutty flavor of fresh porcini. Just clean and delicious, and actually very simple. But again, Telluride, Boyne City, my local, club in Seattle, Puget Sound Mycological Society, these are all recreational pickers. We're all out there doing it for fun. But the people who were doing this for a living remained elusive to me, sort of like this guy, kind of a little bit indistinct, a little bit blurry in the background. By the way, that is about a 2-pound lobster mushroom that he is homing in on there, right there. Probably that might be worth, several dollars to this guy. But, after asking around and sort of talking to a friend of a friend who had a sister who knew somebody whose in-laws might know somebody, eventually, and I mean, I am a reporter after all, so I had to do some digging. And I eventually met this guy. So this is Doug Carnell, and he would end up becoming a main character in my book. Doug is he's what's known as a circuit picker, and he's essentially representative of the first generation of professional mushroom pickers in the U.S. Doug he's operated a crab boat, he's dug razor clams, he's scavenged metal, he's been a cedar, old growth logger. He's done all sorts of jobs, basically within this sort of extractive resources realm. But the thing that he's done most throughout his life is mushroom picking. That has really been the backbone of his career. He lives in the woods, he works in the woods, and he's really representative of that first generation. And these would be guys that maybe we would refer to as sort of the backdoor forager, right? The guy who in the 70s might show up at the one restaurant in town that was serving wild foods and just show up at the back door banging on the screen, and the chef would come out and he'd have a basket of just mixed, maybe mushrooms and berries and maybe a few greens if they were still in season, and the chef would say, "Oh, I'll give you $50 for all that," Well, that was how it got started, right, with the backdoor forager. And then as we got later into the 70s, Americans started realizing, our food system is kind of messed up. Like you go to the grocery store and there's all this disgusting food packaged in like colorful, plastic packages, and none of it is really real. And we're not very healthy, and we need to start getting back to kind of real food. And you had restaurants that were trying to serve more local, seasonal foods, and they really welcomed the backdoor forager. And with that, the business started getting a little bit more organized, and really kind of turned into an industry by the sort of 80s and 90s. And that's exactly when Doug got involved. Basically, probably in the early 80s, he was selling mushrooms to restaurants. And so he's representative of that first generation of professional mushroom pickers. And we're going to talk about subsequent generations as well. So I met Doug, and just right off the bat, he invited me into his world, where most of these people really, you've probably heard that the mushroom business is just a little bit clandestine and people are kind of secretive. And some of that is true, and some of that's a little bit of a put on. But for the most part, guys who were doing this for a living really didn't want someone like me peering into the business. But Doug, on the other hand, he loved this bit. He, loved the fact that he was a mushroom picker, was proud of it, and wanted to tell me everything that he knew. So he just said, hop into my beat up old Buick, which he called the Blue Pig, and I'm going to take you for a drive and we're going to go pick some mushrooms. And that's how it started. So I first met Doug on the sort of ragged west end of the Olympic Peninsula in an old sort of rundown logging town called Hoquiam. And we met at a 7-Eleven, and he went in there and got a huge cup of coffee, which was basically his only nourishment in the field, except for maybe some cold hot dogs that he had in the back and maybe a Twinkie. And I jumped in the car with him and we took off. That first day, he took me north on 101, and we first were on the 101, a regular highway, and then we got on a sort of a country by lane, and then we got on a logging road, and that logging road turned into a dirt road, and then that dirt road turned into sort of a very narrow sort of almost goat path. And then I looked ahead and I saw it sort of bottom out in this giant puddle about the size of this room. And he said, hold your breath, we're going through it. And he gunned the engine and we went charging through the puddle, and we came out on the other side, and the car was okay, and he parked and he jumped out and he got his bucket out. He got a knife about yay long, which he bought at the dollar store where he gets most of his implements. And those were sort of his main tools of the trade. And he said, follow me. And we basically, now you got to understand, this is, we're on the side of a logging road. This is timberland. This is not the sort of place where people like to go hiking, right? There were no trails. There were no hikers. Doug was not wearing Patagonia. He didn't have any Gore-Tex on him. He had a hoodie that he bought at the local consignment store, and he had some work boots and jeans, and his bucket and his big knife. And so he parted the evergreen huckleberry and the salal and the Oregon grape and started into the forest. And I mean, this was late October. The moment you step into woods like that, it's like you've walked through a car wash. I think I was soaked almost from the moment I stepped into the woods. And I followed him, but you can see there, he's got pretty long legs. He's a tall guy, and he moves pretty fast because as a mushroom picker, you have to move fast. And I started falling kind of behind. And after a while, I couldn't really see him through all the sort of second growth timber. And then after that, I really couldn't hear him anymore. And at that point, a sort of paranoid thought crossed my mind. I thought, what if all of this was just a way for him to get me into the woods so that he could like spin me around and see if I was like man enough to find my way out, Like with some other occupations, like say fighter pilots or firemen or cops, if this was sort of a masculine hazing thing that was going on. But then right after that thought crossed my mind, I heard Doug up ahead. He was calling for me. He was standing on the ridge, and I just banished all further negative thoughts because I knew he was really looking out for me. And I followed his voice, and I got up on the ridge, and he just sort of stretched out his hand and said, "That's what we're talking about." And I looked down into this sort of little valley below, and all I could see was the moss carpeted with hedgehog mushrooms, as far as the eye could see. Yes. And we just started picking, and you could see some of those hedgehogs right there. This was early in the hedgehog season, so he was getting top dollar at that point, and I think he was getting about $7 a pound, just to give you a sense of the scale. On that day, he probably picked about 40 pounds of hedgehogs. Now, there are a lot of secrets in these slides, so look closely to the backgrounds and foliage and everything you see. If you ever make it out to the Pacific Northwest, that is, because this is very specific to this region. But notice all the sort of woody debris in the background there. That is red cedar, okay? That is cedar that is left over from the original harvest of those woods, which probably happened more than 100 years ago. In fact, these woods have probably been harvested 2 or 3 times since then, okay? So that is old growth cedar right there that is decaying back into the sort of forest floor, all right? Now, the mushrooms are mycorrhizal with a different tree. They might be mycorrhizal with Douglas fir or something like that, but it's that cedar that Doug was on the lookout for because it creates this wonderful decay in the woods. And if we go back and look at the previous slide, look how mossy that is, right? Those are the sort of woods that Doug is looking for. He's looking for old cedar bogs when he hunts for hedgehog mushrooms, because that's what they really like. That's all spruce right there. But eventually we would get into the sort of leftover cedar slash from the original logging of this forest. So that's the sort of level that Doug is working on, you know, which most mushroom hunters don't even think about stuff like that. But I would continue to learn from him these little secrets to find good patches. So there it is. And that's actually its new, the spreader hedgehogs, as they call them. That's its new Latin name, which I just updated on this slide because these names keep changing, you know. But this is the new name that we'll probably have for a few years until it changes again. And so I started hanging out with Doug a lot, just follow him around to patches. I met his picking partner. Like Doug, Jeff Lacey was originally a commercial fisherman. And then an accident on board a fishing boat that took a lot of his large intestine with it relegated him to mushroom picking. So he wasn't working on fishing boats anymore. He was picking, and you can see he's got some nice king boletes right there. And so I just started following these guys around. There's Jeff with a very nice 5-pound cauliflower mushroom. He probably got, I don't know, $25 for that single mushroom right there. And then the buyer probably turned around and sold it to a chef for about $50. And that's, you know, more than 10 years ago. That price has only gone up since then, although not that much, but more. One of my favorite mushrooms. I don't know if you guys find many cauliflower mushrooms here. You don't. You know, like porcini, it has a kind of nutty flavor to it, but you can see that it's just a totally different texture, and you can cook the heck out of them. They're always al dente. I really love them in like pot roasts and things like that, because they will infuse whatever you're cooking with the, you know, the fungal juices, but then they also take on the characteristics. So the carrots and celery and the beef and the red wine and all the good stuff. So there's sort of like a two-way street with this mushroom. One of my favorites. So, you know, I followed these guys around. Here they are with a nice collection of golden chanterelles. That was a fraction of what they picked on that particular day. I mean, just being out in the woods with these guys made me realize, first of all, I mean, this is serious stoop labor, okay? They're up before dawn, you know, heading to the patch. There's competition. They've got to get to some patches before other pickers. And that means getting there early. And then when you're working in the woods, you're bending over to pick those mushrooms, and you got to clean them and present a nice clean basket like that to the buyer, or the buyer will tell you to get lost, you know, go sell it to somebody else. I don't want dirty mushrooms, you know. And then at the end of the day, depending on what's going on in the market, you might not even be making that much money, you know. But the flip side is you're in the woods, you're your own boss, you know, and there are other advantages as well that we'll get to. So with any sort of, interesting writing topic that's out there, you're kind of looking for tension, right? Well, built into this business is a natural tension because you have the pickers who are picking the mushrooms, and then you have the buyers who are buying the mushrooms from the pickers. And right there, you just have that natural economic tension that exists. So this is Jeremy Faber, who runs a business in Seattle called Foraged and Found Edibles. Jeremy had gone to school in Vermont for forestry, loved the woods, loved to ski. He came out west. He landed in Seattle, and immediately he'd been cooking all his life at different restaurants, and immediately took a sous chef job at a restaurant, and thought that maybe, moving up to chef and eventually owning a restaurant was going to be his career path. He worked at a really fine dining restaurant just outside Seattle for a number of years, and he was the guy on his day off who was always bringing in the wild foods that would be used in some sort of special of the day, and eventually realized, wait a second, I really enjoy being out in the woods kind of more than in the kitchen. And so in 2001, he set off on his own. He left the restaurant and started Foraged and Found Edibles and started providing Seattle restaurants with wild foods on a sort of regular daily basis. And not just Seattle, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, New York, Paris, London. I mean, as his business grew, the demand grew. And there were people like Jeremy in every large city in the US, and especially in the last, say, 10 years. But when he started his business in 2001, it was still, relatively novel to do that sort of thing. You can see him with a whole bunch of baskets right there. That's how all these mushrooms get traded back and forth between the pickers, the buyers, and the chefs. They stack nicely in the back of a pickup or even the back seat of a station wagon. They stack very well in a walk-in cooler, and they nest really nicely when they don't have lids on them. So that is how the mushrooms go back and forth. And initially, he worked right out of his home. This is the basement of his home in Seattle, where he had a couple of employees. And here you can see one of them who is weighing out some mushrooms that are going into a box with a little sticker for the business on it. It's all very bare bones. And that box will get loaded into a van and driven around town, and delivered to local restaurants, or perhaps head off to SeaTac Airport and, get shipped down to San Francisco or something like that. But initially, it was all done in the basement of his home. So here's Jeremy in Raymond, Washington, which is on the southern coast of Washington state. It's probably mid-October when this was taken. It's really the height of the fall mushroom season. And Jeremy has gone out to Raymond to buy from a network of mostly Southeast Asian pickers who have settled in Raymond, and are first-rate foragers. Basically, Jeremy has cultivated a network of pickers all over the West, and especially in places like Raymond, Washington, as you head down the coast, Eugene and Springfield, Oregon, Weed, California, Redding, California. These are all population centers that have large concentration of Southeast Asian immigrants. And these would be sort of the second generation of mushroom pickers. A lot of these folks arrived kind of mid-'80s, I interviewed many of them, and the stories were harrowing. Often it would involve, flight from the Khmer Rouge, maybe a refugee camp for a number of years across the Mekong River, perhaps getting sponsored by a church to go to Australia, and then eventually take a boat to Canada and somehow find your way down into the US. That would be like a typical trajectory. Sang was Vietnamese, and his wife was Cambodian. And so they now live in Raymond, and they pick mushrooms year round, in addition to other things like huckleberries, and all sorts of other fiddlehead ferns and all sorts of other forest products. So Jeremy has gone out to Raymond because there are quite a few foragers out there. And I would see this again and again. I was riding with him, and as soon as we pulled into Sang's driveway, the texts started coming in because Sang could see that he had arrived and had probably sent out a little note on his phone. And within about 10 minutes, there were 30 guys at the back door, all just carrying big baskets full of mushrooms. Yeah. And so basically, he's got his van there that can hold 2,000 pounds of mushrooms, and he intends to fill that up and make the drive all the way back to Seattle. It's about a two and a half hour one-way drive with a full load. And he'll do that at the height of mushroom season, maybe 3 times a week. And he won't get back to Seattle until well after midnight. And then he's got to get all those mushrooms out of his van, into his walk-in cooler. And maybe he even has to make a run to SeaTac at that point. So it's a pretty grueling business to be in. But one of the things that I really enjoyed watching was the grading process. So especially with certain mushrooms like porcini and matsutake, they need to be graded by the buyer, okay? So you can see some of the pickers kind of waiting here with their baskets at Sang's house. And one of the conveniences of doing it at Sang's house is that it's a private residence. It's not, somewhere, on the side of the road in the national forest. And so, they've got sort of more privacy. Sang's wife has put a big pot of rice on. People are hanging out and kind of gossiping and talking and exchanging information. And Sang's house ends up being kind of like a cultural meetup center. And a lot of people, especially who share the same language, can come together and talk about things, and have their mushrooms there. And it's really an amazing thing to watch. And then the grading starts. And once the grading starts, it's just all eyes on the buyer to see, how tight he's going to be grading. Okay. So here he is. He slices up all these number 1 porcini buttons. They're graded on a scale of 1 to 3. There are other buyers that might grade it on a scale of 1 to 4. Jeremy typically was 1 to 3. And a really nice immature button that has no bugs in it, that has a cap that hasn't opened yet, would be a number 1. It's just a beautiful, firm mushroom. The chefs love it. It looks great on the plate. It's really versatile to cook with, and they pay top dollar for that. Okay, then the number 2s would be also really nice porcini mushrooms, but they might be a little more mature, a little softer, not quite as firm as the number 1 buttons. And then the number 3s were generally the ones that were getting sliced up and dried. So those might have some insect damage. They might be kind of big and floppy, and those command a fraction of the price of the 1s and the 2s. So here we are with what looks like a pristine, number 1 button that's been sliced in half. Look at how, unblemished it looks. But if you notice in the top of the cap there, you see that little spot of yellow? See that? Those are insect eggs, okay? And I remember when he sliced this one open and he shunted it aside, and the picker was sort of astonished and said, what are you doing? And he just pointed to that little yellow blemish and said, in 24 hours, this is going to be a wormy mess. And that's true. And so, it would maybe become a dryer if you were lucky. But it was always kind of tough to see mushrooms like that. You just want to kind of eat it right on the spot while it's still good, So there's a nice basket of number 1 buttons being weighed out. And then Jeremy would write up the usual ticket that he does. And you can see right here on this particular day that he was paying $11 for number 1s He was paying $7 for number 2s and just $2 for the number 3s. And so this picker made a little over $100 for probably a few hours of combing the beach scrub, maybe within a stone's throw of the Pacific Ocean, which is where a lot of the beach pick in the Northwest happens. Up and down the coast from Vancouver Island all the way down through Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, these king boletes will fruit like right on the edge of the dunes. You know, you can see the Pacific sometimes. Yeah, as long as the right trees are there with the root systems going under. But there's a lot of scrub that you've got to crawl around in too to find these. It's not easy. So I love this slide because, so as I mentioned, there's, you know, everybody's hanging out, maybe having a little bite to eat, you know, talking about their neighbors or whatever, a little gossip here and there. But then when it's time for hubby's basket to get weighed, you know, the wives are looking very intently, and they're the ones holding the wallets. You know, they've got the checkbook. They want to see how he's doing, you know, because you bring in a basket of wormy kings, and the buyer notices right away. You can feel them. Start slicing them open. If they're wormy, they get shunted aside, and your profits go down. You know, so you can just see the sort of the looks there as they wait to see how well they're going to do with today's pick. But, you know, the buyer doesn't always get to do this in the privacy of someone's home. Often, in fact, probably most of the time, the buyer has to go out on the road and compete with all the other buyers out, you know, in some lonely, you know, back road in the national forest where you put out your sandwich board just like this and try and attract the pickers into your buy station, as it's called. And sometimes you can also do that by having a cooler with some beers and sodas, you know, having a few snacks lying around. But the best way to do it is to maybe pay a little bit more than the next buyer, right? And this is a theme that I come back to again and again in the book. I refer to it sort of as frontier style capitalism, because really that's what was going on out here in the woods. A lot of this is just happening below the radar. Most people don't even realize they're going for a hike or they're going fishing or camping or whatever. They don't even realize that this whole mushroom trade is happening, you know, under their noses. And sometimes it can be very cutthroat. And so on this particular trip, I was riding with Jeremy and we drove out to Darby, Montana, because there had been a fire in the Bitterroot Mountains, which separate Montana and Idaho. And there's a fire pretty much every year in the Bitterroot Mountains. And the pickers know this and the buyers know this. And so this is a stop on the mushroom trail virtually every year, somewhere, either Darby or somewhere near Darby. And so as soon as we got to town, we drove up into the hills to check out the burn, okay? And then we started seeing people on the road. And every time we saw someone on the road, Jeremy would pull over, roll down the window, and he'd say, "Hey, how you doing? How'd you do yesterday? What was the price?" You know, and the picker might say, "Oh, it's okay. We were getting $8, you know, a pound." And he said, "You come by my station tonight, 11." Okay, and word spread, and by the time that evening rolled around and all the pickers came out of the woods, they were all lined up at our buy station, okay? Now, there were 7 other buyers in town, all right, with nobody at their buy stations. And so I'm watching Jeremy weigh out the morels and pay the pickers, and I saw a pickup truck drive by, a white pickup truck. And then I saw it drive by again, same truck. And then 5 minutes later, I saw it drive by again. Well, you could see Jeremy, he's wearing that sort of orange hunter's cap there, and it looks like he's pretty intent on doing his work, you know, head down, you know, looking at the scale or whatever. And I was like, "Hey, Jeremy." And he's like, "I saw it," you know. and I'm like, "You did?" He's like, "Yeah, the white pickup? Yeah, I saw that." And I was like, "Well, what's going on?" And he's like, "That's so-and-so. He's just letting me know by driving back and forth that he's very displeased with me." It was another buyer, okay? and just sending a message to Jeremy that he's not too happy that Jeremy raised the price on him. And somehow he was going to get even. But on this night, Jeremy was raking it in. Okay. And I would see that sort of thing again and again. So, the mushrooms get back to Seattle, where Jeremy's employees dust them off, clean them up, package them up, and send them out on the road, either in vans or to the airport. And here is the late Ron Zimmerman, who sadly just passed away recently, but he has a well-known restaurant just outside of Seattle called the Herb Farm that's been using wild foods for decades. In fact, that was where Jeremy was working when he decided to go into the wild food business full time. And the guy in the chef's whites back there was probably the one guy he was competing with for that plum position. But when Jeremy decided to go out, into business for himself, he became the head chef. And so here we are delivering some mushrooms to Ron for his annual, he calls it the mycologist dream menu. And if you have $200 burning a hole in your pocket, you can, enjoy the mycologist dream menu. It's probably more than that now, but it was $200 back then, probably 10 years ago when I took this photo. And it was a 9-course feast, and every course had mushrooms in it, including dessert. And for dessert, they use candy cap mushrooms, in some sort of fun, creative way. But a really fun feast. And here's Ron taking a nice collection of Pacific golden chanterelles.
And how was dinner?
Dinner was excellent. I mean, that's a good restaurant. They know how to do it. When I sat down, there was a little vial of black trumpet extract that was in front of me, which was meant to be poured into the little glass of Prosecco that they served as a little aperitif to start things off. So very good meal. But I also went to New Jersey, where Jeremy opened a little toehold for himself. He had an employee in Brooklyn. They had a little warehouse space, and went to Newark International in late October, early November to collect a shipment of mushrooms that would then later be driven all over Manhattan to some of the finest restaurants known in the U.S. And on this particular day, it was the day that Obama was coming to town, and so of course they were going to shut the city down, and we had to make sure that all our deliveries were done before noon, before the city basically came to a complete gridlock. But there we are, fighting with everybody else on the morning commute to get through the Holland Tunnel. So, now he's sort of operating on both coasts. Wild mushrooms at this point are really becoming sort of the poster children for wild foods and foraging and kind of local seasonal foods. And it's even more so today. Okay, so I've kind of given you a sense of sort of how the pipeline works from like picker to buyer to chef. Let's take a look at some of the famous patches within sort of that area that I referred to as the Mushroom Trail. So here is Sisters, Oregon, which, at one time, more than 100 years ago would have been a place, for sheep herding and for lumber barons, and was basically a railroad stop, and now is kind of an example of the New West, and it's sort of a place for mountain bikers and cross-country skiers and antique shoppers. Kind of quaint Western town, but happening outside of town in those mountains, there's the Three Sisters in the background. Happening in the mountains outside of town is a pretty vigorous spring mushroom pick that includes these beautiful blonde morels, as well as the black morels, and also spring porcini. And in Oregon, it is very tightly regulated, and the Oregon Forest Service has an area on the Deschutes National Forest where you have to camp if you're a professional mushroom picker or buyer, and they make the buyers, buy a site. I think Jeremy paid $100 for this site for 10 days or something like that. And that's also where all the pickers camp. And it's kind of in an out of the way corner of the national forest. And you can see here the pickers coming in at the end of the day. The weather was pretty good, so Jeremy didn't bother putting up his canopy. And the grading process begins in the outdoors. And you can see, I wish I could have asked her what the number 7. I've always been intrigued by that number 7. But this lady brought in some beautiful blonde morels. And then there was also lots of spring porcini coming in, which is something in the Northwest. Not only do we have fall porcini, but we have a spring variety you may have heard of called Boletus rex varus, which is really great. So every year in Sisters, there's a pretty good spring pick for both morels and porcini, and then the pick might move on to a place like the Bitterroots, as I was mentioning before, for the burn morels. And typically, in the past, the burn morels would come on after the natural morels. But with climate change, we're starting to see some of this stuff get mixed up. And really now, it's almost like the natural morels and the burn morels are all coming up at the same time. But in the past, there was sort of you could almost say there was sort of a distinct sort of seasonal difference, like the naturals, and then you get the burn morels a little bit later as it warmed up. And here we're standing right on the border of Montana and Idaho, and we're looking into Idaho. We're at about 7,500 feet. And basically what Jeremy is doing is he is scouting the burn because he wants to be able to tell. He's probably on the phone with some of his pickers back in Washington and Oregon, telling them to come out and check out this burn. He wants to be able to tell them where to go. But he's also going to be picking during the day, in addition to buying at night, because everything that he picks is just 100% on the bottom line, right? Full profit. And so he's looking to see where to go. He's essentially scouting it. And we'll just go through this quickly. Look at all the forest that is sort of very burned in the foreground here, very dark. You see that? So that's the sort of forest that the pickers would refer to as hot burn. Okay. And there will be morels in the hot burn, but the hot burn, as its name implies, is an area that's it's catastrophic burn. It's just, blackened spars left behind. There's a lot of ash on the ground. The sun is withering and the wind is whistling through. And so any morels that sprout in the hot burn are going to quickly dry out. And if it rains, they're going to get covered in ash from the rain coming down, and they call that ash splash. And it gets all into the nooks and crannies of the morels, and they become gritty and really a terrible food product at that point. So the pickers avoid the hot burn. All right. If you might remember that slide I showed you at the beginning when I was in a burn with a friend of mine picking, that was hot burn. And we were in there. We shouldn't have been in there. That wasn't really the prime location. Now, the prime location, if you can see it in this slide, notice where it's where the forest looks more red. Do you see that? Okay, that's what the pickers call red needle burn. All right. That's where the fire is less catastrophic, where it's more of a creeper fire, okay? And the fires come through and it has stressed those trees, but it hasn't killed them outright, okay? Maybe the trees have dropped their needles, but they're not dead, okay? And all that red needle duff creates just a really wonderful kind of ground for the morels. It holds in the moisture, and the morels can sometimes just carpet in places like that. And then also along creeks, and where there's maybe a little green edge next to the burn, those are prime spots to go. So that's what Jeremy's looking for. He's looking for that red needle burn, and he's looking for creeks and little green edges, that sort of stuff. Yes. Yep.
I'm going to unmute for a second. Oh, yeah. One was, does fire retardant ever concern in those areas?
Yes, fire retardant definitely poses a concern. It's usually used in places where there are unstable soils, where it's really steep, If you can find out from the Forest Service or other agencies where it's been used, then you should avoid those areas. But that's difficult to do. I mean, we all think about fire retardant, but usually we kind of let that thought go. And so you just hope that the area you're picking hasn't had fire retardant on it. Yeah.
And then
Yes, it's not good. Yeah.
Eric was saying he visited the mountains of central Mexico this summer and saw many pop-up mushroom stands. He would pick that morning, or resale vendors selling mushrooms from local pickers. Does that sort of thing happen in Oregon and Washington states, where the picker try to sell their daily work to non-commercial?
I mean, a picker might try and sell to restaurants directly. And I know pickers who sort of cut out the middleman. But most pickers, if you're spending the day in the woods and you're tired and you're dirty, you just want to get to the buy stand and sell your wares and make your money and be done until tomorrow. So, yeah.
Jane is asking about the restrictions on commercial picking in public places. Are licenses required?
So in Oregon, yes, you need a permit. Definitely California is even stricter. I would say Washington is less strict than Oregon or California. But I think that's the direction that we're going everywhere. Eventually, permits will be required pretty much everywhere. But at this point, it's not uniform across the board. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's on the mountain, so this is all vast swaths of state land, right?
This is actually federal land here.
Oh.
Yeah.
So they don't
This
have
is
to deal-
national forest.
They don't have to deal with private. That's not a big concern with private property. stuff.
That's a concern more in Northern California.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And there are a lot of private landowners in Northern California that are a concern, but in Oregon and Washington, huge swaths of federal and state land. Yeah. This is what the inside of a good burn looks like. Okay. So this would be red needle burn. Notice all the red needles on the ground there, making a nice duff. But also notice all the sort of greenery in the background, right? Now, these trees are scarred from the fire, but they're still alive, okay? They're not dead. And this is the sort of habitat that really produces good morel flushes. And when you're in the right sort of habitat, it can look like this. Yeah. Yeah. I know. Kind of makes you drool a little bit, doesn't it? There's probably about 10 pounds of morels just in the frame of that photo. Now, the whole forest isn't like that. You still have to find the sweet spots, right? That means maybe looking for underground water sources, the green edge of the burn, just the right tree type, because they do grow better with certain trees. You still have to know what you're doing. You can't just walk into a burn and score. I mean, there are times when you can, but usually it's not that easy. See the big ones? They call those hand grenades. Yeah. Question.
So are they on a certain directional side? Like the southern exposure?
Yeah. So, I mean, the southern exposure is going to warm up first, right? So if it's been a cold, long winter, and you're waiting for snow thaw, maybe you start on the south side. The problem with the south side is it might not have the right tree composition. Okay. So you have to bear that in mind. And so typically I find my best patches on north facing slopes, because those are going to be the slopes that hold the moisture, right, well into the season. But the north facing slopes might not get going right away. You might have to wait for them. So, you might start on south facing slopes, but they might not be that great because they don't have the right trees, you see? So there's a lot of factors that go into it. Here's a close up. Hard to tell in this slide, but if you look closely, Jeremy there is holding the hem of his shirt in his teeth. Do you see that?
Yes.
So he has created a bucket with his shirt because his bucket is out of reach. So that is one of the little efficiencies that separates the picker who maybe picks 60 pounds of morels from the picker who picks half that. Okay, little efficiencies like that. Now, the way Jeremy's going about it is he's got a big bucket. He's got a pack, which is sort of the pack that maybe an elk hunter would use. right? Except that instead of having like meat sacks on the back, he's got baskets that are nested and bungee corded to it. And as they fill with morels, they get stacked up and eventually stacked up over his head. That's how you get 100 pounds of morels out of the bush with a pack board like that. And so the little efficiencies really pay off. So he'll go into an area with his pack board, and if it looks good, he'll take the pack off, put it down. Now he's got his bucket. He'll start doing circles with his bucket. If it gets really good, he might put the bucket down and use his shirt as a bucket to really clean a small area before he picks up his bucket again and continues to do maybe bigger and bigger circles around that area. And so that way they call it cleaning the patch. And that's how you really efficiently, get all the mushrooms. Yes.
What's the etiquette when two people show up at sort of the same time?
Well, there are no rules about this. Yeah, the question is, what is the etiquette if two pickers arrive into the patch at the same time? I don't think there really are rules about that. And sometimes pickers will just have to put up with each other and not be very happy about it, and I've seen that happen. You hear stories, particularly in the newspapers, and this is more in the 90s, but you would hear stories about maybe some shots being fired, maybe some territorial claiming of patches and that sort of thing. I didn't witness that, okay, but I talked to pickers who said they experienced that. So, I don't think it's anything that recreational pickers should be worried about. I will tell you that, and I get this question a lot, the commercial versus the recreational. Most of the commercial picking is happening in woods that recreational pickers don't want to go to. A lot of them are industrial woodlands that are not very scenic, that are not trailed, that are very difficult to walk through, and that are really dog-haired and dense. And really the only places where I would ever see commercial and recreational pickers at the same time would be a burn site for morels, although the pickers usually know where the best burns are and they know where the best corners are, and they're willing to hike in 5 miles, before they even start picking. Okay. So I don't even see it that much in the burn sites. Okay. The other would be famous Matsutake patches. And sometimes you will see, but like in Oregon, for instance, there's a famous area, you've heard of the Oregon Dunes. There's a lot of Matsutake picking that goes on there. It's heavily regulated. There's only so many commercial permits that they allow. So for the most part, like with chanterelles and hedgehogs and other mushrooms, I just never saw commercial and recreational in the woods together. But for burn morels, I did occasionally, and Matsutake. Was there a question over here?
Well, it was along the same lines. I mean, who remembers the Puget Sound, Michael?
That's my, yes.
And we're aware of Henrietta disappearing.
Yes.
Back in 2013.
I was in the same woods when that happened.
Many of the conjectures that maybe she ran into somebody she shouldn't have, or a bear, or whatever. I mean, all
Yes.
kinds of conjectures.
I've heard that
She's an
too.
older lady, et cetera, et
Yep.
cetera. And you kind of handle it pretty well by saying, yeah, there's a lot of stories that are in the newspapers and
Mhm.
things that I was also stationed on the East Coast, and
Yeah.
I heard stories of upstate New York.
Yeah.
Of certain ethnic groups that carry guns with them all the time, because
Okay.
if you were in their patch, they would. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like lobster pots down
Right.
in the Keys.
Right. Right. I think there are fewer guns in the patch than maybe there used to be.
Okay.
Yeah. But I've certainly seen pickers of all stripes packing. Okay. But there was maybe a time when you had a lot of pickers who were maybe ex-military, from the war in Vietnam or other wars like that, who felt comfortable with handguns and would take them into the woods with them, And I know that there are also pickers who maybe have recently arrived in the US from other countries where maybe they had far more ferocious animals to deal with than we do, for instance, tigers and things like that. And they, heard about bears and mountain lions and had, handguns for protection. Now, I have never run into a problem with a bear or mountain lion. I've seen both in the woods. And so I personally don't worry about it. But I know that there are pickers who do bring handguns for self-defense. I would be more worried about the two-legged animals, frankly. Yeah. So, yes.
He's made a special kind of knife there, and then I'm wondering if you can.
Yeah, his special knife is made in China, and you could probably buy on Amazon for like $3. Yeah. It's a jackknife. Yeah, there's nothing special about it. There's no brush on it. He doesn't use a brush. Yeah.
Is he cutting it right at the dirt?
He is cutting it yes, right at the dirt. Yeah. And maybe he's pulling it and then nipping off the end, which is not a problem. Yeah. Despite what maybe you've heard, because the pull or cut argument goes on and on, but there's no scientific evidence to back up either harvest technique. Yes.
This might be answerable by the focus too. Earlier you mentioned that was for hedgehogs.
Yeah.
And cedar growth is a source. I wonder if it must be available maps detail of what forest communities exist where to find the stand of cedars.
So Doug has actually gone there in the town of Forks, which became famous because of that vampire novel. And what am I thinking of? Does anyone know? Twilight, famous from Twilight. Well, Forks is also before Twilight, it was famous as a logging town. Right on the edge of the temperate rainforest. And they have a logging museum there. And Doug has actually visited that museum and pored over the old maps and read about when harvests happened and all sorts of stuff to glean information. Yeah. Oh, there might be government stuff as well. It would be worth checking it out.
Wouldn't tell you what the old growth harvested, but that's what you're looking for, like.
Well, but what's interesting is finding out maybe what the original trees were, okay, and then what they call it reprod. That's the production forest that gets planted after the initial cut, and then find out what the new forest is. Because as you all know, if you want to find mushrooms, you got to know what your trees are, right? And mushrooms are connected to trees, and if you know what trees were there, and also what trees got planted subsequently, that can really give you a leg up. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on here. So as I mentioned, little efficiencies really pay off in terms of just how many mushrooms you're going to pick. So there's the pack board with the baskets stacked up on it. Notice all the greenery there. So this was an epic pick right here within this burn, because Jeremy basically located an area where you can't see the water, but there was an underground seep. And that's why all that sort of green growth is there. And the morels they just went right down like a gold vein. I mean, it was incredible. I wish I'd gotten a picture of that, but he picked it before I could get there. Okay, let's quickly talk about a few of the species. Because, morel taxonomy is like a moving target. And in fact, one of the things I do with the new paperback edition is update all the scientific names. So they've really been changing, but just a quick tutorial on some of the morels. The main morels that get picked are kind of the early flush of morels that are the very typical looking burn morels, and they are in the left foreground there, okay? And the pickers and the buyers call those conica, and that's an industry term, and conica is an out-of-date Latin name that now only applies to a morel species that's in Europe. But that name has stuck, and it's used in this country to denote a very typical burn morel. And now we've learned that there's actually 2 or 3 species that fit that category, and they can't be separated by eye. You need a microscope, okay? So that's the bulk of the burn morel harvest. Then you have some specialties, okay? And one of the really wonderful specialties that everybody gets excited about, it goes by different names, but most people call them grays, okay? And the gray is the one burn morel that you really can easily tell with the naked eye because it's so distinctive looking. But there's another quirk with the grays. They come in 2 color phases. Okay. So in the back left corner, those are the typical grays. They're a gray color. But then in the front, on the right that is also what we call a gray, but a lot of the pickers call them blondes because they're more of a blonde color phase. All right. But notice how densely pitted they are. And also the ridges of those pits are kind of crumbly. Okay. And when they're young, they actually have gray stems. And as far as I know, I think they're the only morel that doesn't have a white stem. And when they're really young, that stem can be very gray, but then as they mature, it sort of washes out and it almost looks white at that point. But when you cut them in half, they are very dense, and pickers will refer to their double-walled sort of flesh because they have well, essentially 2 layers of flesh inside that's easily seen when you cut them in half. So they're heavy and they're dense. They're wonderful for stuffing. They're really big. I mean, actually, you're going to see a picture later on in the presentation that shows you how big they are. But they can be quite enormous, and they're really exciting to find. So here's a bunch of morels that are being dried in the sun. This was in Washington at the foot of Blewett Pass, a burn that I picked several years ago, and they probably had thousands of pounds that they were drying in the sun. And I guarantee you almost all those morels were getting shipped over to Europe, okay, where they love their morels. But it's a lot cheaper to ship dried morels to Europe than fresh morels. They lose when you dry them, they lose 90% of their weight. Well, here we are back in a food picture. When the morels are coming up, it's also the same time that the spring chinook are going up the Columbia. And the springers, as they're known, are really, some people will tell you that is the best cut of salmon that there is. And so I like to have my fish with some land fish, the morels, and a nice little wine reduction from the Willamette Valley. That's a pretty good way to end the day of morel picking. Okay, so let's continue on. After the spring pick in places like Sisters, we kind of come into what a lot of people would think would be the doldrums. Okay, it's hot, it's summertime, the forest is crackle dry, but even in August, there are mushrooms to be picked when the forest hasn't seen rain in a month. And especially if you go to the old growth Douglas fir forests of Washington and Oregon that retain a certain amount of moisture the way only old growth forest can manage. You might get into some of these guys right here. These are lobster mushrooms. So the lobster mushroom pick really sort of gets going kind of at the end of July and in August. But, there could be pickers that are still picking burn morels at that point. In fact, if it's a really good year, you could be picking burn morels at high elevation until October. Okay, even though it's a spring mushroom, it continues to flush if it gets the rain and at high elevation. But a lot of the pickers will change because you get bored picking the same mushroom. You want to pick something new. And at the beginning of a flush, you're going to get the higher prices for a new species. So when the lobster mushrooms start coming on, that's when some of the pickers shift and they start picking these beautiful lobster mushrooms. And when the forest is really dry like this, is when the lobsters are at their nicest because they're firm, they're dry. Do you guys all know? Are you all familiar with lobster mushrooms? You know how it's a twofer, right? It's a species of fungus that's parasitizing another species of fungus, turning, in this case, the Russula brevipies into a bright orange, crazy-looking thing that looks like it maybe landed here from another planet, into a choice edible that has a little bit of a hint of the sea to it, which makes it a really, I would say only in the last 10 years or so have chefs really kind of caught on to lobster mushrooms. Maybe 15 years ago, you hardly saw them in restaurants, and now they're all over the place from coast to coast. I love making a lobster risotto with both the main crustacean and the local I call this my, West Coast meets East Coast, double lobster risotto. But you could do it with shrimp and it would be really good, and all kinds of other things. My most recent dish that I made with lobster mushrooms was actually a tikka masala, a veggie tikka masala so no chicken or anything in it, just lobster mushroom, and it was off the hook. It was really good. So lobster mushrooms are super fun, but we're going to now talk about what is really sort of the centerpiece for the fall harvest. Now, the thing is the fall harvest really starts much earlier than fall, okay? And this would be the sort of habitat where it would get going. Now, I just showed you some old growth Douglas fir. Look at the size of these trees. I mean, those are big, beautiful, that's fir and western hemlock in there, just big, beautiful trees. You get to this right here, there's not a stick of old growth forest in that photograph. Everything you see in that background there, this is the Southern Olympic Peninsula. That has all been logged, maybe 4 or 5 times, okay? That is all second, third, fourth growth, primarily Douglas fir forest, okay? Douglas fir is the premier timber, in this country. And it just happens, a little quirk of the timber industry, that this particular mushroom really likes young Douglas fir. And so the pickers know this, and they go to timber country. They go to places where the timber is harvested on pretty short rotations, like 40-year rotations. It never gets very big. Well, it does get big, but not like that old growth. And it's pretty dense and dog-haired. But inside forests, working forests like that, are where you find the Pacific golden chanterelle. Yeah. And I've been enjoying some of your chanterelles here, different species, and they were really, really good. I would say, I don't know, it's hard to choose your favorites, but I was really impressed with your chanterelles. These chanterelles in the right habitat just come up in huge numbers. And it's probably the biggest volume pick of all the mushrooms. And so the pickers, if they can hit it at the beginning of the flush, they're going to get a good price. But that price, once there's a glut on the market, is going to come down rapidly. So here I am with Doug and Jeff, and we're in the Olympic Peninsula, timber country. You can see this old spur road here, from the initial logging. And basically, we're on top of a ridge, and they're going to dive off of this ridge on either side and just work their way down a pretty steep slope, zigzagging back and forth and just picking all the chanterelles they can find. They're going to start the day farthest from the car, and each time they fill their bucket, they're going to go back to the car, they're going to dump it, maybe get a drink of water, and then walk not quite as far away as the last time until by the end of the day, they're picking right around the car. And on this particular day, I think they each picked about 60 pounds of golden chanterelles. So here you can see Doug emptying them into the basket in the trunk of the Blue Pig, his old Buick Skylark. Yeah?
I have a question. In the Douglas firs, how many years after they're planted can they expect to find chanterelle?
I think the sweet spot is around 25 to 40. When they're younger than that, when they're like 15 to 20 in that age, they're still pretty dense and dog-haired, and I think a little older than that is the sweet spot.
The reason I asked
Yeah.
is that we have a member who just spent 4 years in Sweden studying to manage industrial forests there, and he said for chanterelles there, which was primarily fir and spruce, was our finalist spruce was up there.
Oh, really?
Before,
so similar.
Before they started really getting any chanterelles appearing.
I think what has to happen is the forest has to recover.
Yeah.
Those sort of mycorrhizal connections have to be reformed,
Right, exactly.
And then they start going off. Yeah.
He said it was interesting. They had some stuff where they went to, he said after about 65 years, the 90 years because they had some that they weren't cutting.
Yeah.
They were on rotation.
Right.
Took them on rotation. He said after about 65, 70 years, the chanterelles were still there, but not in the kind of quantities. And the understory kind of.
Yeah. So for instance, I never go to old growth forests to harvest chanterelles, at least not golden chanterelles. The white chanterelle is a different story, but mostly on the east slope of the Cascades. Yeah. Question over here.
Yeah. Have you ever, under travels here in the States, positively considered the concern of overharvesting mushrooms, or is that kind of? Yeah,
I get this question all the time. It's a sustainability question. Yeah, so the question is, can mushrooms be overharvested? And is that a problem? I mean, so far, the science suggests that we're not, overharvesting. If mushroom populations decline, it's for other reasons. And it has to do with, basically what we're doing in the woods. If you cut down the woods and you pave them over, guess what? You're not going to have mushrooms, right? But, as I tell people, mushrooms, it's kind of like picking cherries from a tree. If you take care of the tree, right, it's going to have cherries every year. There are good years and bad years, right? But if you take care of it, you should have cherries every year. I think the same thing is true with the mushrooms. And I suspect that we're really just picking on the edges. There are limits to sort of how deep we can get. Some of these areas are pretty vast. That said, if any information comes out that we are doing things that are unsustainable, then I would be the first one to say we need to, do it differently. And I think we should be cognizant of that. We should treat the woods with respect. The thing that irritates me is when I see people leave trash behind or, just a heavy footprint. But that's all user groups, not just, mushroom pickers get blamed for a lot of things, but all user groups have their impacts, yeah.
That's just a short follow-up. And you think if it were to come to some sort of scientific or anecdotal evidence of overharvest, you then consider responsibility on workers like us to consider mitigation?
I think we should lead always. But the reason I love mushroom hunting is I think it's kind of a low bar for getting into the woods and really enjoying the woods and just turning people into stewards of our resources, and if you can get kids out there into the woods hunting, that sort of dopamine hit, of finding a mushroom. Well, that's something from our deep ancestral past, right? From our hunter-gatherer past. We all have that. And I have never met anyone who didn't have a thrill from finding their first mushroom. And if you can give a kid that, maybe you've created the next sort of, great steward of the wilderness. So, education, getting out there, that's kind of what I'm about. And I think mushroom hunting is a great way to do that. Yeah. 1,000 pounds of mushrooms. Speaking of, is it sustainable? Well, believe me, I've seen incredible hauls of chanterelles come out of the woods of Washington. And then you go right back into the same woods the next day, and there's just more to be found, But this was 1,000 pounds that was in a forager's, I think it was in their sort of carport. And they had spent a week picking these, and I think they got $2 a pound. It was a whole family. And it was interesting because the parents did most of the picking. The kids they were like teenagers. They didn't really want to do that. They were going to school, but they did the heavy lifting. And then the grandparents were cleaning the mushrooms. And so when I arrived at their house, they were sort of out on the front stoop and they were just cleaning mushrooms. And yeah, but a lot of mushrooms. Little gnocchi with a chanterelle gravy there. Nice way to enjoy the fruity goodness of the chanterelle. I'm sure you're all familiar with chanterelles, and you know how they have that kind of hint of stone fruit to them, which is just so nice. They're sort of a surprising mushroom, and their flavor is so kind of different from others, and that's a wonderful way to enjoy them. Pickled for that early flush, when the rains haven't really gotten going and the mushrooms are still kind of small and very firm and dry, that's a good candidate for pickling. And that's just a traditional pickle right there. With porcini, I do a different style pickle, this is a typical vinegar pickle, which has been processed. But with porcini, I'll use olive oil, and that's a refrigerator pickle because I don't process it. But that olive oil just becomes like the best bread dipping sort of thing. And then you can add any aromatics that you want, chili pepper, bay leaf, pepper, whatever, peppercorns, etc. So two different styles of pickling, and mushroom pickles are really good. Great way to put up your catch. Okay, let's head on here. We're getting deeper into the fall now. Everybody's been grinding it out with chanterelles, which really, chanterelles after a while, people grow to hate them because you have to pick so many to make money because the price really drops on them. And it's just, it's just stoop labor, and everybody gets kind of tired of channies. But you could kind of alternate and start picking this mushroom. And there's certain famous patches where people go to pick it. And probably one of the best known is in this little town in central Oregon, just north of Crater Lake, on the spine of the Cascades, sort of eastern slope in the rain shadow. And don't blink because you will miss this town otherwise. But near Chemult, Oregon, we have these dry pine forests, which to most people's eyes would not look like good mushroom habitat. Looks way too dry. Ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine. But in these sort of dry forests on the eastern slope of the Cascades is where you might find really nice quantities of matsutake. Now, this is a mushroom you also might find within sight of the Pacific on the coast. What they have in common between the coast and the spine of the Cascades is sandy soils. Okay, in the case of the Cascades, it's sort of the pumice-laden soil from all the repeated volcanic eruptions over eons that have laid down this sort of nice volcanic soil that is very sandy. And very similar to the sandy soils you would find on the coast. And those sandy soils are what the matsutake prefer. Now notice, you can see the gills there of that matsutake. Because of that, that one would be knocked a few points off the grading scale. But we'll get into that. So I went to matsutake camp because I'd heard a lot about this area and the picking that was going on there. And when I was in this area, so Crescent Lake is right near Chemult, and you're just north of Crater Lake. And in this general area, there were about 3,000 matsutake pickers. So it's very heavily regulated by the Oregon, by the feds, by the National Forest in Oregon. And it starts the day after Labor Day, and it goes for 2 months. Okay. And you need permits, and they will move the pickers around. They will close areas and open areas and move them around. And they're all there to pick matsutake, and they set up these camps with sort of, the stringers and posts and tarps, and they will settle in, for a couple of months of intensive matsutake picking. And often, thanks for coming. Often, whole family units or extended families will show up, and there will be pickers, and there will be people supporting the pickers who maybe are doing laundry or cooking dinner or doing other sort of jobs that need to be done in camp so that, the matsutake can get picked. And some of them will have a guard dog too. You can see here, the Forest Service has put up these signs in several different languages. Somebody told me this is Thai. And basically what it's saying is you cannot rake the forest floor. Okay, that's illegal. You are allowed to use a little probe to look for the matsutake, but they don't want pickers raking the forest because that is hard on the trees, it's hard on the ecosystem. But the reason the raking was happening is that all the best grades of matsutake are frequently hiding underneath the duff. And they make what you've probably heard of, mushrumps, these little bumps in the duff. And sometimes you got to peel back that duff before you see the mushroom. And so people would rake to find the mushrooms, but that's hard on the forest. It bangs up the roots, and so they've outlawed that. And now they just use little probes to kind of peek under and see if the matsutake is hiding there. And you can see this is Joy, who was a buyer but who's doing some picking, and he's using one of those little probes, and you can barely see the little cap poking out. But do you see that? It's hard to see. There's a little white sort of eye looking at us there, and basically I went out with him, and he took me to a spot, and the pickers have their spots, and it's kind of like, it's like a Rolodex for them. It's all up here, and they know the zip codes of the matsutake because they know the individual trees where the matsutake live. And they've gotten to know these trees over the years. And some of these trees have been handed down by relatives, and they fruit every year. And the matsutake will come up in these same spots at the same time year after year. And the pickers know where they are, and they will gather the matsutake, and then they will they will be very careful about it, and they will clean their spot, as it's called. They will keep any evidence of their picking so that no other picker stumbles upon it just by mistake and finds their patch. They're pretty intense about it. Here's some number one matsutake buttons. Notice how dirty they are. That's okay. This is one mushroom that seems to be, the pickers aren't expected to really clean them up the way they are with other mushrooms, because most of this matsutake is going over to Japan. About, I think, something like 90% of it. And maybe that number has changed in recent years because people in this country are starting to learn more about matsutake, and you're seeing matsutake more in restaurants, but it's revered over in Japan and parts of China, and they want to see the dirt on the mushroom. And especially, they don't want to see the stipe cut. You never cut the dirty end off the mushroom. You leave it intact, and that's how it ships. And so the scale is usually about 7 or 8, graded from 1 to 7 or 8. And a mushroom like that, an immature button, where the gills are totally covered with the veil, is a number 1. And then if it has a little tear in it, like that guy, that's probably like a number 3 right there. If it's a tiny little tear, it might be a number 2, and so on down the line. There were something like 30 buyers in town when I was there this particular year, and they were set up in all sorts of places, including this defunct gas station, and in this, which actually makes a lot of sense. Because at the end of the season, you just hitch it up to the truck and you take it to Cave Junction or Grants Pass or the next stop on the Mushroom Trail and set up again. And it's bulletproof. Just kidding. But you can see some grading happening in there. So as I said, there were about 30 buyers and 3,000 pickers when I was there this particular year. And the pickers were getting $20 a pound for number 1s and number 2s. When I came back the next year, they were getting $5 a pound. So that just kind of goes to show the fluctuations of the trade. Now, the pickers and the buyers will argue endlessly about why this is so. And, the buyers will tell the pickers that they need to read up on the laws of supply and demand. And the pickers will accuse the buyers of collusion and all of that. But really what's happening is it's become a global trade. And especially with the development of China, matsutake is coming out of places where it never came out of before. I was over in China in 2011, and I was just blown away by how much development was going on. I mean, super highways and bridges and all sorts of development into places that had never had that, and they're finding matsutake all over. But they're also finding it here. So matsutake is now being found all over the U.S. in places where we never thought it was. It's much more of a global trade, and that affects the prices, and they can swing wildly. Somebody had a question? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's child labor. children involved?
I'm sure that people bring their kids in to pick, but most of the time when I saw kids involved, they weren't picking. Yeah. I mean, it was pretty much adults. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think child labor is an issue. Yeah. So this is where we were camping, Matsutake Camp by Lake Crescent. There's a buyer in the background. You can see a picker who is fanning his night's earnings. He did well. He made $500 that day. Pretty good haul. Being in Matsutake Camp was so much fun. It was like being in Steelhead Camp. You know, everybody's sitting around the fire, having a beer at the end of the day, swapping war stories, telling lies, throwing out red herrings, trying to kind of get their competitors off the scent, you know, maybe talking about a place that was really good that wasn't good at all, you know, that sort of thing. But it was just really fun. It was really cold. I mean, every night was below freezing. And yeah, you needed that fire for sure. But I had a great time in Matsutake Camp. And then the truck pulls up. And the truck is something that all the buyers have gone in on. They pay for it collectively. And the truck comes by each camp, and a guy jumps out and starts loading the baskets into the back refrigerated truck. And all those baskets have been tagged with the grade number. So all the number ones are in one basket. The price is on there, how much, the quantity. And the guy's on a headset talking to his boss, you know, about what the night's earnings were. And then once that truck has made the rounds and gone to every Matsutake camp and filled that whole thing with Matsutake, it's going to Portland. And then it's on the next plane, and that Matsutake will be in Japan the next day. Yeah. I mean, these are ephemeral products, right? They are fleeting. They need to move quickly. And that's how it works. There was even a noodle house in Matsutake Camp. I guarantee you they did not have the right permits for this. Again, sort of frontier style capitalism, right? But you could go into this seasonal restaurant that was only open 2 months out of the year. Some of it was covered in tarps, you know, and you could get a $2 big bowl of pho, you know, that would really be nice at the end of the day when you did not feel like cooking. There was a very large Lao population there in Matsutake Camp, and I got to meet some of these folks, and they were having a big party that I write about in the book, and they were raising money to build a Buddhist temple in Springfield, Oregon, and so they were having a big party, and there were some monks that were hanging out, and this guy here blessed my book project. And for that, I think I gave him $5 that went towards the charity, you know, for the temple. But it was really fun hanging out in Matsutake Camp. You know, I don't know how much experience you all have with Matsutake. It took me a while to really appreciate it. And I would say, you know, at first it wasn't my favorite. As David Aurora famously says, the aroma is a provocative compromise between red hots and dirty socks. Yes. You've all heard that, right? So it's got that sort of, the dirty socks is that sort of funky, fungally flavor, right? Married with a sort of a spicy cinnamon-like kind of thing going on. And basically, I've come around to really feeling like I do it in sort of traditional Japanese and Sichuan Chinese ways. I think that's how that flavor profile works best. And I think Matsutake really wants to be with more kind of Asian style ingredients like sesame oil, rice wine, rice vinegar, those sort of things, rather than say butter, cream, cheese, olive oil, the sort of things that we associate with more Western cuisine, like French and Italian. I once had a Matsutake frittata, and it was nasty. It was not good. But chow and mushi, which is sort of almost a sort of a similar sort of Japanese sort of style with a really runny egg, you know, somehow it works in that, you know. This is one of my favorites. So this is a traditional Japanese dish called doben mushi, which just means steamed teapot. You serve it this is a traditional doben mushi teapot that a sushi chef in Seattle brought back for me when he visited his family in Japan. Really nice gift. And basically you just make a very subtle sort of broth with a few maybe manila clams, some fish bones, that kind of thing, just a very subtle kind of seafood broth. And then you put the matsutake in there and it infuses it with those flavors. It kind of takes it to the next level. Just really, really delicious. And then you eat, the little pieces of fish and shrimp and greens with chopsticks out of the pot. Really, really good. This is more of a Sichuan dish. Matsutake is very dense. When you have a nice matsutake button and you cut it along the stem, like in half, the knife will squeak. That's how dense it is. And I just think that both the texture and the flavor really stand up to sort of the ingredients of Sichuan cuisine, like hot chilies and Sichuan peppercorns and that sort of thing, because it is such a robust mushroom. So I love to do it. I do a lot of Sichuan cooking, and I like to do it in that. And this is a traditional Sichuan dish with chicken, but especially for vegetarians, get rid of the chicken and just have the matsutake. It's delicious. And this is my favorite way to have matsutake, especially with a large group of friends at the end of the day of picking matsutake. And sometimes I'll see pickers, especially Japanese American pickers, on the side of the road near Mount Rainier, which is a famous sort of picking ground in my home state of Washington. You'll see them on the side of the road with a hibachi making this. And it's matsutake sukiyaki hot pot. And I like to get just one of those little camp burners, and put it on my dining room table and get a cast iron skillet, which is sort of the traditional way to do it in Japan. And you make a broth with water, sake, soy sauce, and sugar. It's a little bit sweet, but super simple to make that broth. By the way, these recipes are all on my website. But you make that broth, and then the first thing you do once it's simmering is infuse it with the matsutake. And again, it just takes what is already a really good broth, it just takes it to the next level. And then it's super fun with you and all your friends getting the chopsticks going, and you have all these fresh ingredients like thinly sliced ribeye and cabbage and onions and pre-cooked noodles and stuff like that, and tofu and green onion, and you just start throwing it into the simmering hot pot and let it cook, and then pull it out, and everybody's got a little dish of rice, and by the end of the night, there's sort of like a sludge at the bottom of that doesn't sound very appetizing, but let me tell you, every single one of the people who comes to my house and has this wants some of that in a to-go cup, with a little rice at the end of the night. And it is fantastic. And the matsutake basically just helps elevate it. And of course, it's just a really good mushroom by itself. And so basically, I guess this is a way of saying I've learned to love matsutake. And again, I like to kind of cook it in more traditional Japanese styles. And I just think it's really good. And it's such a fun mushroom to find. And when you have a good flush, there can be a lot of it. But like some of the other mushrooms we've talked about, it tries to hide, and it makes those shrimps, and you have to be able to spot them in the woods, especially if you want to get those good number one buttons that are hiding out of sight. But the thing about matsutake is you really develop your nose for it. And after a while, you can smell the matsutake when it's in the woods. Yes, I have found matsutake in a place where I did not know that it was by smelling it. So you got to develop that kind of extra, little something. Okay, I know we've been going for a while, but we got to get to the final season here, okay? Because the thing that makes sort of this area that they call the Mushroom Trail, the greater Pacific Northwest, the reason that we have this whole kind of underground business happening in this region is that you can pick mushrooms there in the middle of winter, okay? So it's never over. You can pick day after day. And as we get colder and the days get shorter, okay, the pickers start heading down into southwestern Oregon, or if they're bold, northern California. That presents its own, sort of predicaments, but which we'll get into. But especially the area of national forests around Brookings, Oregon, in southwestern Oregon, for what they call the winter pick. Again, You will see up the labyrinth of logging roads, you will see, these sort of structures in the woods. Notice that he's got a little stovepipe coming out of it, keeping nice and toasty in there. Might be there for a couple of months, picking mushrooms and, being out in the woods. There are three really big mushrooms for the winter pick. This, one of my favorites, picked it yesterday in your woods, well, to the north. I just love black trumpets. So that's one of the winter pick species. Then these guys are close relative of the black trumpet, yellowfoot. I used to kind of poo-poo yellowfoot a little bit because, when you put them in the pan, they're sort of limp and, they look like a bunch of cephalopods in there, but they are so flavorful and good. I've really learned to love yellowfoot. And as do black trumpets. Yes, they rehydrate really well. And then the third would be the hedgehog, especially what we call the belly button hedgehog. Notice how it's got the little innie belly button there. And hedgehogs are wonderful. They have such a complex flavor profile. I think of it as sort of an exotic kind of flavor profile of like coffee and chocolate and maybe some other spices, and they're very robust. One thing that's great about hedgehogs is they will last a couple of weeks in your fridge. So that's very useful to a chef, right? They can have those hedgehogs in their walk-in for a while and not worry about them being kind of overcome with bugs or whatever, or just going bad. So those are the three winter pick species. And again, we get back to sort of, this eternal sort of disagreement between the pickers and the buyers over the financial transaction. On this particular day, I was staying in Brookings at the Blue Inn Coastal Suites Motel, I think it was called. And there were three buyers that were in rooms adjacent to each other and setting up their buy stands right outside their rooms. And they were all paying 75 cents a pound for yellowfoot. And at that moment, I really saw it more from the picker's point of view. 75 cents a pound, you can't even pay for gas to get into the patch, So,
and it takes a billion yellowfoot there.
Yes. I mean, yellowfoot, you got to pick by the handful, But then, if you don't like what's going on in Southwestern Oregon, you could try your luck over the border. But as soon as you get across the border into California, all of a sudden the regulations change and there's other issues to deal with. And I write about it in the book. And this is the one chapter, the California chapter during winter pick, where things got a little dicey for me. But you know what? It wasn't the pickers. It was other people in the woods. Especially, and you guys all know you got to watch out for the tweakers and people like that. But I'm not going to go into it because I don't want to spoil that chapter. But let's just say our campsite got kind of disturbed in the middle of the night. And then here's Doug again. Doug was just such a great sort of guide to this world because he'd been there from the early days, from the early 80s, basically, when this whole industry was just getting going and still is hardly recognized, right? But he's been there pretty much from the beginning. And I realized that with Doug, and he still was living sort of hand to mouth, and he didn't have a bank account, and I think he's finally gotten a cell phone, but, the number keeps changing, and I never know really how to get in touch with him. But when we were down on the Lost Coast of Northern California, we went to this one black trumpet patch, and he just couldn't exactly remember where it was, but he'd been picking it for years. And he'd be like, oh, it's over the next ridge. And we'd hike another mile. Oh, it's the next ridge, And then finally, we ate up half the day trying to find this one black trumpet patch. But I realized for Doug, it was kind of like seeing an old friend, and it was also a kind of a form of mastery, that this is a patch that he had picked for years, and he doesn't use a map and compass. he's just solely looking at the landmarks and what he remembers and kind of studying the little indicators of the trail. Well, there's no trail, but looking, there's probably trees that he remembers and just a certain feeling. And eventually we located it. And it wasn't like that patch even really paid for the day, but, he was really happy to have found it once again. And that was just really a kind of a nice thing to see. Black trumpet's one of the few kind of jet black foods that we eat. Really creates a contrast with whatever you're cooking. And the only other thing I can really think of is maybe squid ink, that sort of draws that sort of color. But you can see in a winter risotto how it really stands up and just looks great. And then it's sort of simply sauteed in butter. I think black trumpet's just simply sauteed, and they saute in like a minute, because they're thin. So they're so easy to cook, but they're so flavorful. So really that's just a garnish. And actually in the second photo here, this is a garnish too. Now this is my cream of chanterelle soup, but I like to garnish it with black trumpet because as I tell people who take my classes and stuff, I think that the black trumpet kind of out-shanties the chanterelle. It's like an intense distillation of the chanterelle in some ways. You're getting that stone fruit and other sort of chanterelle-like qualities, but just in spades. And it looks great as a garnish in a chanterelle soup. Okay, so we're going to finish up here. Thank you for staying with me so far. I want to finish up in the Yukon because part of this sort of reason I took on this book was the sort of romance of it and the adventure and going to interesting places and getting kind of off the grid and just seeing things I'd never seen before, meeting people I'd never met before, and kind of learning this kind of hidden business and this sort of secretive way of life. And it just seemed like the Yukon really embodied all that. So I got a call one spring, and it was Jeremy Faber, and he said, the morel pick down here in the States is terrible. I'm going to Canada. And he said, do you want to come with me? And I was like, first of all, when I told my wife that I was going to do this book project, she objected outright. Like, she was like, she'd seen all the newspaper stories. She'd heard about territorial pickers and gunshots in the woods and all of that. And she said no, but I did it anyway. So I wasn't in her good graces, and she really wasn't excited about me going to the Yukon. But I realized that I had to go, And so I got on a plane that I'd never heard of, an airline. I can't even, it's called some North something Airlines. And, we're flying over BC, and it's just like, I'm looking out the window and it's just like wilderness all the way up for hours, and we fly into Whitehorse, and then immediately Jeremy wants to rent a van. There are no vans at the rental place in Whitehorse. So he's really upset. He rents the largest SUV he can find, which could only carry about 800 pounds of mushrooms. And we drove 5 hours east. And we ended up at a little burn site that he had heard about from some pickers through the network. And we set up a spike camp on the side of a logging road amongst the moose and the grizzlies. And immediately Jeremy, there were a couple other buyers set up, and immediately he raised the price $1. And the pickers started swarming in to our encampment, and we would pick during the day, and then Jeremy would buy at night. And it's the land of the midnight sun, so, you're picking till about 10 o'clock or something. And so really nobody's bothering to come in until pretty late. And here's this guy with a nice batch of morels. Here's the picture I wanted to show you. If you want to know how big grays are, there you go. That kind of gives you a sense. And that's just typical right there. I do not advocate a tobacco, product being mixed with a culinary product, as we see here. But again, it is the Yukon, things happen in the Yukon. But those are some really nice gray morels right there. And then we met these characters here. On the right was Margot, and she lived in Vancouver and just decided she was going to pick all summer and sort of have a go at it. and she made herself this great mosquito netting, which was a good call, let me tell you. And there she was out in the patch with her bikini top and her camo and her motorcycle boots. And this guy on the left was just happy to be in the picture with her.
That's a super remote part of people are.
So, pickers found out about it. We met pickers from all over Canada. We met pickers from Montreal.
Aren't they got them the same way you do?
They spent the whole summer there. They picked all summer. Yep. But it's a good point. Most of the people we saw were Canadian. Okay. We were American, and that was not lost on this Canadian buyer who is talking to Jeremy Faber right there. He's on the left. Now notice the body language, right? Couple of roosters squaring off, Basically, that buyer on the left is letting Jeremy Faber know that he's an American. He knows he's an American, that he doesn't have the permits, which we didn't have, and that any moment he could just decide to drop a dime on him, and alert the authorities that there's this American up here who's, doing business when he doesn't have the right paperwork. And that's all because Jeremy raised the price. And this guy's boss would not let him raise the price. So he was buying morels at $4 a pound. Jeremy was buying them at $5, and he was paying $6 for grays. And so the way they worked it out in this sort of great frontier style capitalist way was that Jeremy agreed to buy his entire inventory. Yeah. Now, that also meant getting a lot of subpar morels, because what would happen is a picker would come by who was maybe not a very skilled picker, and his morels were dirty, or they were old, or they didn't look good. And Jeremy would say, there's another buyer down the road who's buying dryers. They would basically all be dried. Go to him. Okay. Well, now Jeremy had to buy all that as well. But you know what? It was worth it to not, kind of get off on the wrong foot with his Canadian compatriot.
You don't want to get that guy with a bit.
Exactly. So that's how they worked that out. And every couple of days, we drove back to Whitehorse with a full SUV load of morels that would then be put on a plane and sent down to Seattle. And one of Jeremy's employees would have to come to the airport and pick it up. And one time he had to come to the airport in Vancouver and pick it up. And it was a young guy who was working for Jeremy, and he wasn't used to the border crossing situation. This was pre-COVID, but he still had to deal with the border. And apparently he blew by the guy who was trying to make him stop, and they came out with pistols and cuffs, and and they worked it out. But
So how's the Canadian keep his job if he doesn't buy any mushrooms?
well, no, Jeremy bought his whole inventory. That's how he kept his job.
So he's got a little bit money on.
Well, he still got $4. He still got his full. He sold all his stuff. He just wasn't getting the good quality that Jeremy was getting. Yeah. So here's a picture of me. And every day we would pick, and literally we were picking right out of camp. The first day when we got there, we pulled the car in to our campsite. I got out of the car. I picked a morel a foot from where I opened the door. Okay. We continued. We picked further and further from the car, but we never drove anywhere. We picked out of camp for 10 days. And so there I am with the little knife that Jeremy makes fun of me for, with the little brush on it, and he gets a kick out of that. And you can see I've got 4 baskets on my pack board. Each one of those baskets holds about 12 pounds of morels. And then I've got a bucket out of frame that probably has another 10 pounds or so in it. So I've got roughly, 50 or so pounds of morels right there. So, the whole time I was working on this book, this sort of big fat number stuck in my head, and it was 100 pounds. It was this number that got tossed around, that when you were really at an epic pick and you knew what you were doing, you could pick 100 pounds in a day. And when I embarked on this book project, that number seemed fanciful. I mean, it really seemed like the stuff out of mythology. I just didn't believe it. I didn't think it was possible, But as I got to know these guys and how they did it and the nuances of it, all of a sudden I realized, well, actually, these aren't just a bunch of lies, in Matsutake camp. You could actually pick 100 pounds in a day if everything lines up right. And so that became kind of like my white whale, and I was pursuing it. And so I come out of the woods for lunch, and that's when Jeremy took this picture. So we're just sort of, I'd gotten up at 5 a.m. and started picking because the sun was up, and the mosquitoes were just devastating, but, deal with it. And I've got about 50 pounds by lunch. And Jeremy's like, all right, go get some lunch. I felt like he was sort of proud of me. I was happy, I was doing it. And he said, eat some lunch and get back out there, and you might have your 100-pound day. And if you want to find out what happens, you got to read it. And I'm happy to say it's now out in paperback. This has been a long time coming. But it's got a new cover, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. It's got some new taxonomy in it. It's been updated. And lots of stories and secrets. And if you read closely and you ever come out to my neck of the woods, you might know what to do. Thank you so much.